Hello, and welcome to the third of our three-part series on Blessed John Henry Newman, Firmly I Believe. I'm James McCullough, and I'm speaking to Father Guy Nichols in the library of the Birmingham Oratory. So, Father Guy, I was struggling to remember some of the names of the hymns that Newman wrote, but we have those famous ones, Lead Kindly Light and Praise to the Holiest in the Height. Tell us a little bit more about these.
There's an irony in this, really, because those really famous Newman hymns, as we think of them, and I'd also include Firmly I Believe and Truly as well.
Yes.
They are the ones which, although they're the best known, are actually not hymns in origin at all.
Okay.
So Lead Kindly Light began its life as a poem, which Newman wrote in 1833. He was on his way back from Sicily to England, having just survived a terrible illness which nearly killed him, and yet which, in a way, even while he was under the worst effects of it, he knew providentially he was not going to die from. He said, "I shall not die, I have seen the light." And that kindly light became an important theme in not just that poem, but also the whole of his future development of his work, the light of faith. And the light of glory beyond it. And he also said, I shall live because I have a work to do in England. Right. And it was when he got back to England later that spring, he was just in time to take part in the launch of the Oxford movement.
I see.
So that's how that fits into that particular...
Very providential. Yes. But of course, when he was in Italy travelling around, he disliked the excesses of Rome.
Yes.
Even though he brought something back with him interiorly from that experience. Maybe that was just the illness, I don't know. But.
Well, of course, Rome was an important part of that particular trip. Earlier on, he was there. He was in Rome for Lent and Holy Week in that year, and he went to some of the services like Tenebrae in Holy Week and heard the famous Allegri Miserere in its original setting, because obviously it was written for the service of Tenebrae in Holy Week. And so he was very impressed by what he heard, and particularly the sound of the voices. So he never heard anything like it, very different from the style of English singing. So he compared it to the sound of organ pipes. There's something about the way they hold these long notes, and it was much more like organ than the voice, he thought. And he was quite fascinated by that. So he came to encounter different musical cultures for the first time during that trip, because it was the first time he'd left England. And he also encountered some Turkish music.
Really?
There was a pasha who was being accompanied on some kind of trip somewhere in, when he was travelling around. In must have been North Africa, I think, was when they stopped off one way.
Yes.
And he heard this strange kind of pipe music, and it struck him, because he thought, well, yeah, music is a very cultural thing, culturally determined thing, and different cultures have very different approaches to what music is about and what constitutes beauty in it. So that I think was a big reflection in his mind thereafter, and of course he has a lot to say about music, as well as the love he had of playing it. He also saw it as an important sign of heaven. And this comes into the other great poem, his longest poem of all, The Dream of Gerontius.
Oh, yes.
Which, of course, is a long account of what happens to a soul from the immediate onset of death through to entry into purgatory, and all that takes place between. And those two famous hymns belong to that poem. So Firmly I Believe and Truly is Gerontius, the dying man, making his act of faith before he dies. So his last great act is to say, yes, I do believe. He renews his faith. And then beyond his death, one of the stages towards his meeting God, which of course results in his request to go to purgatory. God doesn't send him to purgatory. He asks to go.
Right.
But one of the things that leads up to that climactic moment is when he first encounters the chorus of angels. And it's the chorus of angels. In fact, there are several different choruses of angels that take part in this kind of antiphony of praise. And the praise to the holiest in the height is the kind of refrain that links all these different passages. And these different choirs of angels, the way that it's actually written in the poem, are singing different aspects of God's wonderful providence in creation and in the sending of the Son and in the Son's wonderful work of redemption and our rescue. Our fall, of course, obviously is an important part of that as well, you know, the fact that man falls in this poem. So it's a longer poem, it's a longer part of the poem than we're used to. Okay. There are many more verses of it that we don't hear. And I think if people know Elgar's setting of the Dream of Gerontius, there's a copy of the score of that here as well, of course, then they will also know that there are other verses that appear in Elgar's setting which don't appear in the hymn version that we're familiar with.
I see.
So, many of Newman's hymns, in fact, as I was saying, are actually not so well known. He wrote many translations of breviary hymns, which are not much used these days, and also a lot of his own compositions, which are nowadays quite infrequently sung. We still sing a few of them here at Birmingham in the oratory. Some hymns in honour of St. Philip, some in honour of Our Blessed Lady, in May time particularly. Yes. But otherwise, quite a lot that don't get sung so much.
That's a fascinating insight into the other side of Newman. We don't often see.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Because he was following this whole idea, the Philippine tradition of the Laudi, the songs of praise, which were popular songs in the vernacular. And so he wanted to reproduce that in an English context and with English styles of words and music. And so he was consciously adopting and adapting what he picked up from the Roman style of St. Philip, in the 16th century style, and making it into an English 19th century style.
To continue our talk about Newman in Birmingham, he established various missions here. Tell me a little bit more about his work for the poor in Birmingham.
At the time he set up the oratory in Birmingham, of course, it was a much smaller but very dense populated city, and of course heavily industrial. So there's a very poor and of course I'm the poor, a significant volume of Irish already there.
Yes.
So they were beginning to flow in large numbers, because this was, of course, as I'm sure you'll know, this was exactly the time of the Great Famine.
Sure, yes.
So this is when you begin to get very large numbers of extremely destitute Irish people coming to England, and also with no kind of qualifications of any sort whatsoever. So they are purely labouring people and not often in good health. So, and of course, in these very densely populated, unhealthy quarters of the city, they were rife with disease. So there was a lot of real social neglect and poverty, which Newman, of course, encountered. Not, of course, out in Maryvale, which was in that time out in the countryside, in which he was given by Wiseman as a place to form the oratory first in February 1848. Okay. But then shortly after that, because right from the beginning, one of the things that Newman said was, the oratory is intended to be an urban apostolate.
I see.
It's not a country thing. So although they had for a very brief period of time also to take on the care of cotton in North Staffordshire, which is even more rural than Maryvale,
right,
for reasons which I won't go into now. Okay. But he was obliged to take that on for a short time. He got rid of it as soon as he possibly could in order to get back to Birmingham. That's when he came in from right up in North Staffordshire, came into central Birmingham to Derrit End, which was the poorest of the poor parts of central Birmingham. Right. And there, of course, they encountered, as I say, terrible poverty and illness and ignorance. One of the things that Newman wanted to do was to provide for their needs as far as possible, also for their education. So he did set up school, not full-time school, because there wasn't much opportunity for that. These were people who, even as children, were being forced to work. So it was evening schools when they could actually, the children could get in from whatever work they were doing. So there was a lot of trying to cope with extreme social oppression. And he was doing his best to try and help them through all of that. That mission, as I say, was eventually taken off their hands in the time when Bishop Ullathorne took over the direction of the city as bishop. And then they moved out here. And this was also envisaged to be their permanent home, whereas they just inherited a place already existing in Derry End, as they'd also inherited Maryvale as a pre-existing site and the buildings. Here, this was virgin territory.
Right.
And so what Newman was able to do was to build a house. So that the first part of the oratory here, built in the early 1850s, was this house. And then he had plans to build a permanent church next door, which were never fully fulfilled in his lifetime. But that's another story, of course. But he built a very kind of makeshift church, which nonetheless was over the years was beautified quite successfully by benefactions and also by the work of his great friend, another Tractarian Anglican clergyman convert called John Hungerford Pollen. But he'd been a married clergyman, so he never became a priest.
Right.
And he spent in fact most of his life as a Catholic as professor of fine arts in Dublin.
I see.
Newman invited him over there, and he was largely responsible for the University Church in Dublin, as we have it now to this day. So that's where you see the best of his work. But then, looking after the parish here, Newman was as I say, he was very early on taken up with the Achille trial. This happened almost immediately.
Yes.
And the university in Dublin.
Yes.
And then shortly after he came back from Dublin permanently, his friends, fellow converts, people like Pollen, of course, who had children, asked him to found and hopefully to direct a school such that would be able to prepare their children for university, because it was at this time, the late 1850s, that at long last Cambridge and Oxford abolished their requirement that you had to be an Anglican, you had to sign up to the 39 Articles before you were even allowed to matriculate in university.
Yes.
So now, of course, others than purely believing Anglicans were allowed to attend university.
Yes.
This, of course, is where a whole new set of problems arose with the English bishops.
Yes.
That some of the English bishops said, well, it's not safe to go to these Protestant or recently Protestant universities.
Yes.
But nonetheless, while they were waiting for this whole problem to be sorted out, it took some time for it to be dealt with. Newman was prevailed upon to provide a school to give an education to the children, and he himself thought, yes, well, whatever the decision over the question of Oxford and Cambridge for Catholics turns out to be, we still need to have students of a sufficient calibre to prepare them for university, who can then go to Dublin.
Right.
Because one of the things that he was already experiencing by the late 1850s in Dublin was that it was very hard to get Catholic youth of a sufficient educational standard to enter into university studies.
Yes, I could imagine.
So that he was looking for ways in which he could actually help to enhance the preparatory stages, which would bring them to university level, so that they would then from here be able to go over to Dublin and get, as he was hoping, of course, a standard of education that was of equal worth to what they could get in Oxford and Cambridge.
Right. So these were schools. I mean, the Birmingham Oratory was a school that was run along English boarding school lines, but was by no means a private school as we know it today.
No, it wasn't. And of course, there were various things about the way that he established the school which were quite deliberately and consciously different from the schools that many of his contemporaries knew about, the big public schools of the day. And the role of the matron was one of the most important of those. In all the great English public schools, they were very masculine institutions in every respect. There was very little feminine aspect of it. Newman always valued the feminine, especially in terms of care and judgment of character. Yeah. And so he looked to his friend, Mrs. Wotton, who was the widow of one of his other Oxford friends, to come and be the matron to look after the boys, both as a domestic matron, so that many of the boys lodged with her in a house that was just a few hundred yards up the road here. And also so that he would turn to her and say, what do you think about this particular boy's character? Do you think that he might be destined for this or that kind of vocation? And this is one of the reasons why he fell out with Nicholas Donnell, one of the priests of the community who was running the school. Nicholas had been at Winchester, which was one of the grandest of the Anglican public schools. Yes. And he very much did not like the idea of Mrs. Wotton having anything like a parallel authority with his own. He was the head, she was just matron. And so he didn't like the fact that Newman would turn to her in order to get her judgment. And that's one of the reasons why he fell out. But he stuck to his guns. Mm-hmm. So when Nicholas Donnell resigned, along with the staff of the school, at Christmas one year, Newman just simply got on the train on Boxing Day, I think it was, went down to London, went around a few of his friends and whipped up a few people he knew, said, can you provide a bit of teaching just to tide us over in the school? And he got a full staff by Epiphany when the school started again the next year. Gosh. One of those who came in on that occasion, in fact, was Gerard Manley Hopkins, a recent convert of Newman. So Newman actually said, well, here's something you can do while you're thinking of something else to do with your life. Come and do a bit of teaching for us. Right. So that was Hopkins's connection with the school. Yes. I mentioned all this really, this isn't a red herring, it's because this is the explanation of why Newman got particularly weighed down with these issues and why at this particular time he wasn't so much doing directly himself with the parish, but he was taking a very strong interest in what was being done for the parish. Mm-hmm. So he certainly was very anxious that the care should be taken of the parish. So some of the other fathers who were here, like Father Stanislaus Flanagan, were particularly concerned with the care and the welfare of the parishioners and those who were most in need. It wasn't quite such a poor part of the city, of course, as Derryt End had been, but there still were people who needed looking after, and Newman was very anxious to make sure that they were properly catered for. But then also, and again, this would be in conjunction with Bishop Ullathorne, he realised that there were places outside their own sphere of influence. And of course, strictly speaking, there weren't things like parish boundaries in the way that we understand them at that point. There were areas of influence more than anything else. And there were regions kind of beyond the immediate kind of area of the oratory where there were great needs that were recognised. And so he was very largely responsible for the establishment of a mission over in Winston Green. I see. There was a great area of wasteland called Birmingham Heath, and it was incorporated by the city council, well, the town council as it was then, of course, as a means of providing land for big civic institutions. Okay. As part of the whole, kind of growth of the civic character of Birmingham, along with the great plans like the Birmingham Town Hall and the City Hall, as it would be. A lot of that. There was alongside that, there were various projects to do with trying to cater for the needs of a city with a growing population, especially a poor population. And so on that site were established the infirmary, which would become a big, important hospital, which is still there. Yes. Dudley Road Hospital, or City Hospital has now been renamed. There was the workhouse for particularly for elderly people, but generally people who wouldn't be able to find work otherwise. So they were given a home there and obviously work. So rough conditions, but nonetheless this was better than destitution. Sure. And there was an asylum for those who were mentally ill. Right. And of course the jail, which is still there, Winston Green Prison. Okay. Well, they're all still there to this day, except that the asylum has now been absorbed into other provisions, and so also has the the workhouse, which became a geriatric hospital. When I was a curate over there many years ago, that was still going as a geriatric hospital, and an asylum, and the main hospital and the prison all still there, as they had been in Newman's day. In recent reorganisations over the last 20 or 30 years, they've gradually been changed, but the hospital is still there, and so is the prison.
Yes.
But that was where Newman came in again, because he established a mission to these places. And one of the things that I remember, as I said, I was a curate over in Winston Green as a young priest before I joined the oratory. And one of the things I was delighted to discover, and I thought was very typical of Newman's hidden life, was that in the registers of the parish, the earliest entries of people being baptized and buried in the mission in Winston Green were signed by Edward Caswell.
I see.
So I thought, oh, wonderful, the great hymn writer, but also wasn't lost on me even then that this was one of the Birmingham oratorians, who was taking care of this mission to a very, very poor part of the city with these big civic institutions. It was an oratorian project. And then later on that was extended a bit further geographically to an area beyond the city boundaries, which is still outside the city actually, although it's geographically close, called Smethwick.
Okay.
And Smethwick also had a mission established in it by the brother of one of the priests here. Right. And he set it up and lived there. But it's still, to this day, known as St. Philip's Parish, St. Philip Neri. I see. So the connection with the oratory is still there.
So to what extent was Newman fulfilling, or rather sort of replicating the mission of St. Philip Neri?
As I said before, the whole of St. Philip's project was to do with bringing people to a stronger sense of practice of their faith and understanding of it. I suppose Newman was more aware of the need for education in the faith than Philip would have been. Philip, after all, belonged to a world in which the Catholic faith was still, what the culture that people lived and breathed in. In 19th century England, that was not the case. It was something that people had to be nurtured in often very difficult and hostile circumstances. So the emphasis on education was an important part of what Newman realised had to be provided here, which wasn't necessarily the case in Philip's own practice. But what went beyond that, of course, was the whole idea of inculturation to the life of prayer and the sacraments. So therefore, this is something which he very much wanted to replicate here, and hence, of course, the whole adoption of laudi, vernacular songs to be used not in the liturgy, but in devotions that would be held alongside the liturgy, and whose purpose was, and Newman was very, very strong on understanding this, was to arouse a sense of religious fervour through devotion. As he saw it, it was to do with the real apprehension of the truths of our faith. He said, it's not just enough to know that God is one and God is three. You've actually got to be able to feel the strength of that apprehension in your heart by the devotions which are dedicated to it. And the same with, for instance, devotion to Our Lady, which is again a very important part of the whole oratorian practice. So St. Philip was deeply devoted to Our Lady and to fostering devotion to her among his subjects. Right. So too was Newman. Right. So hence, of course, the great devotions that he himself wrote for Our Lady in the month of May, which are in his meditations and devotions, and the musical hymns which he wrote for those devotions, which are still used here, but not very well known outside the oratory. I'm sure I never heard them anywhere else. So that is very much a part of the way in which Newman thought you have to arouse the religious spirit through devotion, not just through the intellect. So the two things went, in his mind, sort of in equal step. You couldn't have the one in isolation from the other. So the intellectual aspect of the faith, the creed, etc., needed also a warmth in the heart. And hence, of course, the heart was always a big thing with him, both in terms of the way in which he communicated the truth but also in the way in which people assimilated the truth themselves. So the heart has to be fired up, has to be warmed by devotion.
Yes, yes. Father Guy, this has been a fascinating insight to the sides of Newman that most of us don't know. So we thank you very much indeed for sharing your knowledge with us and taking the time, and for welcoming us to this wonderful library here in the Birmingham Oratory.
Well, it's been a very great pleasure for me too, James. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.